Hunter, which state in the United States, of course, which state do you think gets the most amount of tornadoes on average every single year?
The state in the United States that gets the most tornadoes every year, on average. I Part of me wants to say Kansas just to shout out the Wizard of Oz, but because that's in my
It's not a bad guess. Yeah.
popular culture imagination. But I'm going to guess Mississippi.
Interesting. It's neither Kansas nor Mississippi.
Okay, so I've just got 48 guesses left, right?
48 guesses left. Well, you're not too far away from the state that does actually get the most amount of tornadoes on average. Of course, there are yearly differences, and that's something that we always have to account for. But the state that gets the most amount of tornadoes is Texas. So a lot of tornadoes
state too. That should tip me off a little bit. Yeah,
it's a big state, and it's geographically, it's in something called Tornado Alley. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit more about that and sort of the nebulousness of sort of the borders of that region a little bit later. But it is firmly within what we would call Tornado Alley, which means it has the right kind of geographic elements to create this very unique, very dangerous and deadly phenomenon of the tornado. And so the Kansas would also be part of Tornado Alley, along with Oklahoma and a few other states. Mississippi and Alabama are not quite a part of the traditional Tornado Alley, though we are going to talk about them because something very unique is starting to happen to them, and there's some very unfortunate realities that have come into play with some of their tornado issues that don't quite hit the other states in the same way. And we're going to talk all about that. Should be a really fun episode. Listener, if you're not already aware, which, again, you clicked on this, so you should be. Today, we're going to talk all about tornadoes, primarily because, for one, we are in the middle of tornado season, right? Spring, summer. This is the time when most tornadoes are happening. A lot of tornadoes have already hit sort of the general region of Tornado Alley in the United States. But also some big ones have been very well known to have hit other regions of the world. A big one that I'm thinking of is one that hit the Guangzhou metropolitan region in southern China. Mm-hmm. And that actually caused quite a bit of damage. We'll talk a little bit about that tornado because there's some interesting parts about China and their tornado issues that, again, not quite the same as the United States. And those happen to go with some development patterns. Again, we're going to talk about that. The other reason why I wanted to talk about tornadoes is that there is a brand new Twister movie called Twisters, just plural, they just pluralized it, that just came out. It came out the 19th, July 19th. As you're listening to this would be on the 30th, so it's now about a week and a half old, but you can go back and watch that movie and get more of a feel for this phenomenon that we're talking about, which is interesting because while it's definitely well known, and I think most people have an idea of twisters in their head or tornadoes in their head of what they look like, at least in this country, I would say most people haven't really experienced them because they don't happen in where most of the population of the country lives.
Right.
It's a very specific area, and we're going to talk about that. So I think it's one of those things where it's like it captures that imagination of people, right? They this phenomenon, this otherworldly phenomenon that comes down and like connects the sky to the land and creates this funnel of wind and storm and rain and all that fun stuff. So we're going to talk about that or we're talking about tornadoes because of that movie that's just come out. I did want to point out one thing because we're going to talk about this all the way at the end of today's episode. The new movie apparently, I haven't seen it yet, apparently completely leaves out any mention of climate change, even though it's about sort of storm patterns that are growing, incredibly strong in power. And we're going to talk about tornadoes and climate change today. So we are going to broach the subject, and it's going to be, I think, a little bit interesting from what people are going to expect because, well, I'm just going to leave it at that. We're just going to, it's a little hint. Stay until the end. We're going to talk about it. It's not. Yeah, it's not what you would think at all. At least it wasn't when I started my research. All that's to say is, let's talk about some twisters, Hunter. So
let's do it.
First question, Hunter. I would love it if you could just try and describe a tornado for listeners in case they are unaware.
Right. Well, I have to say first that I can't say that I've really experienced a tornado before. Although, I've seen lots of images, right? I've seen the original movie Twister, I've seen The Wizard of Oz, but I've also seen, these programs on television where the storm chasers and they're chasing these things,
Right.
and then dramatic footage from the news. And it seems to be this sort of funnel of wind that, whips around, this sort of skinny funnel that sort of twists around, which is, I guess, why they call it a twister, and kind of destroys most of the things in its path and knocks things over, picks things up, and projects them into the air hundreds of feet. So that's what I'm getting from tornado.
I think you captured it. Certainly, I think you captured the popular imagination of a tornado, right? This idea of this spinning, whirlwind this whirlwind, this whirling of wind that, connects the sky to the ground and then basically creates this path of destruction. And that is true for some tornadoes. There's obviously, a lot of, and we're going to get to some of this in a little bit, but there's a lot of tornadoes out there that won't cause really any damage at all to anything sort of, obviously they'll, might lift up some bushes or something, but it's going to be relatively very mild amount of damage and certainly nothing material to like buildings, right? Most tornadoes, in fact, are pretty benign overall, or at least a large chunk of them. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But let's go high level. Let's talk about how a tornado even happens. So we're going to do a little bit of sciencey stuff. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm pulling this information from another source. And so I guess all that's to say is I'm actually not a climatologist here who can get too deep into this stuff. So bear with me a little bit. So high level, a tornado is a violently rotating column of air that is in contact with both the surface of the earth and a cumulonimbus cloud, or in rare cases, a cumulus cloud. Are you familiar with either of these cloud types here?
I know of them. Probably should know this. I took some climatology classes, but obviously it was not as attentive as maybe I could have been. Yeah.
Well, I'm not that surprised because I imagine most people don't really know what a different cloud type is because it is a very small section of a specific science.
Not my kind of job.
A cumulonimbus cloud. Those are those. If you've seen a lot of clouds, those are those like really big fat clouds. They sort of go very far wide and very tall, right? They're like just very big and sort of. They almost have like an oppressiveness about them. A lot of times they're like very gray and dark and stormy. So those are cumulonimbus because they're foreboding. Absolutely. Yeah. And so they're up there. And these are the ones where a lot of water and weather has sort of condensed. And that's why they look so, foreboding and, thick, for lack of a better word. And so the tornado will largely funnel out of these clouds for that specific reason. Of course, as we've already mentioned, tornadoes can often be referred to as a twister, whirlwind, or cyclone, although the word cyclone is used in meteorology to name a weather system rather than a single tornado. So keep that in mind. Tornadoes also come in various shapes and sizes, and they are often, but not always, visible in the form of condensation tunnel originating from the base of a cumulonimbus cloud. So all that's to say, there are tornadoes that are basically invisible to the naked eye. And so sometimes that happens and sometimes you'll see a video, right? Somebody's recording something, and all of a sudden a sign or something gets picked up and sort of spins around and gets thrown, 20 meters away or 20 feet away. That's something that just happens. And that was a tornado. It just wasn't visible to sort of, the naked eye. Most tornadoes, at least inside the United States, have wind speeds less than 110 miles per hour, are about 250 feet across, and travel a few miles before dissipating. These would be classified as minor tornadoes generally. Okay. Now, that still seems like
fast. Yeah.
It's still pretty fast.
It's pretty windy. Yeah.
It's still pretty windy, but it's not, it's like, and it can cause some like minor damage. But when you start to think about it, it's 110 miles per hour. That is less than the mile per hour of some of the lighter hurricanes, which again, they'll cause some damage, but they're not blowing, houses over, not necessarily uprooting trees. It can happen, but it's pretty minor. And if you think about the width, right? So it's 250 feet across. Again, that seems really big. If you're looking at it, you're standing at the base of it. Of course, that's going to look pretty big, but it's also pretty narrow, right? So it's the chance that that tornado is going to cause any damage is going to hit on the right spot and actually hit something is pretty slim. Now, that said, on the extreme end of the high end, tornadoes can attain wind speeds of more than 300 miles per hour.
Wow.
Can be more than 2 miles in diameter.
Oh my goodness.
And stay on the ground for more than 60 miles before dissipating. So that gets a lot more destructive when you get one of those bad boys.
That's a big one. Yeah.
That's a big one, right? Now if that landed in the middle of a city, it would level large parts of the city, which I do believe happened in Joplin back about 10 years ago, Joplin, Missouri, where it basically carved a big path through that town, that city. Various types of tornadoes would include the multiple vortex tornado, the land spout, and the water spout. And so these are, they kind of sound, it's basically what they sound like. So multiple vortex tornadoes have 2 or more vortex columns that originate from the same cloud. They kind of look, they kind of look pretty cool. They're usually typically weaker than a normal tornado. I don't know if that's the case for all of them, but that's sort of what the data that I saw. And then there's land spouts and water spouts, which are more narrow tornadoes, so very, very thin, and are generally pretty weak, but still form sort of that column that you can see. The difference between them, of course, is that one is on land and the other one is on water. A water spout, of course, is taking up a lot. So if you look at a tornado that's on land, a lot of the debris that's pulling up is going to be a lot of dirt. And that ends up being one of the things that's really destructive, especially to humans, right? Because these little things can hit you and cause a lot of damage. A water vortex is obviously not pulling up dirt. It's going to be pulling up water. And so it has that sort of effect to it as well. Some other tornado-like phenomena that exist in nature would include the gust-nado, the dust devil,
I've heard of
the
those.
Fire whirl, which sounds particularly scary. I don't ever want to see a fire whirl.
Right.
And then the steam devil, which I have also never seen a steam devil. I can say that. So my grandparents used to live in the deserts of Nevada, and as such, I did see a lot of dust devils out there. Have you ever seen a dust devil?
I believe I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not.
I would say most people who
interesting, but it's not quite as intimidating as the 300 mile per hour storm you described before.
Right. Well, and it's like the primary difference, and the reason why these are tornado-like, they're not actually tornadoes, but they're tornado-like in that they create like a little funnel system. You can sort of see them blowing around. They're usually pretty small, right? So the dust devils I've seen have never been really larger than a human being, right? Like a 5 foot, 6 foot tall human being. The reason why they're not technically tornadoes is because they're not forming out of a cloud. They're not technically connecting the sky to the earth, right? In the same way that a tornado is. Instead, it's just creating a little phenomenon, usually some very highly localized, shifting of sort of what pressure systems combined with wind, and it just sort of gets caught up in itself and it'll blow something around for a little bit, usually dust. That's all it is. A fire, what was it called? A fire whirl?
Right.
Where did my notes go? So fire whirl. The fire whirl, I actually didn't look this up because it was sort of this is just a footnote, but I'm going to look it up right now because now I'm curious.
Possibly be.
So here it is. It's a fire whirl or fire devil is a whirlwind induced by a fire and often at least partially composed of flame or ash. These start with a whirlwind, often made visible by smoke, and may occur when intense rising heat and turbulent wind conditions combine to form whirling eddies of air. And these eddies can contract a tornado-like vortex that sucks in debris and combustible gases. And so there's a picture here, which it does look very scary. And it seems like these are mostly due to wildfires that are occurring that have sort of mimicked similar scenarios where there's pressure systems and winds blowing through, and then it just captures some of that fire and will blow it around into a very scary phenomenon that I definitely never want to see. I don't want to witness that.
I'd be okay with missing that, I think.
Now, obviously, as humans, Hunter, we like to measure things, right?
That's true.
I would argue that we like to try and measure everything as we possibly can. And so we have created a whole system of measurement just for tornadoes. Have you ever heard of of, actually, we have two. We have two measurements. Have you ever heard of the Fujita scale by any chance?
This is going to shock you to learn that I'm not familiar with the Fujita scale. Yeah. Fujita scale.
It's funny because if you watch the old movie Twister,
Yeah.
not the new one, Twisters, they do mention the Fujita scale in it, or at least they mention like the different scales of, right. They're tracking these tornadoes. One's an F 0, one's an F1, one's an F2, something like that, right? They're like, oh, we got to go find this F4, tornado. We got to storm chase it.
I'm going to have to watch that one again to glean these kinds of facts up and to prepare for the new movie as well, of course.
Yeah, I would be curious, and we're going to talk about this. I would be curious to know if the new movie mentions the scale, and if they do, if they mention the old scale or the new scale, because I think, let's talk about it. So we have these two scales, Fujita scale and the enhanced Fujita scale, and they're more commonly referred to on sort of their numeric scale, preceded by either F or EF. So F0, F1, F2, or EF, blah, 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 blah. The enhanced Fujita scale was created to reflect better examinations of tornado damage surveys in order to align wind speeds more closely with what the expected and associated damage would be. Okay. And so we'll see sort of how that sort of plays out when we get into sort of some of the different scaling here. But I did want to call out that there is a geography that's attached to these scaling systems as well, because not every country uses the same scale anymore, if you can believe it. So the United States and Canada have adopted and now use the enhanced Fujita scale since 2007 and 2013, respectively. The rest of the world still uses the older Fujita scale. Apparently, however, in my research, the enhanced Fujita scale is being more widely used, perhaps more locally, rather than sort of nationally adopted. But it is being used in other places outside of the U.S. and Canada as well. I guess I just want to point that out. Officially, though, it's only Canada and the U.S. that use this new scale. To me, though, this probably makes sense. And we're going to talk about why later in today's episode. But it makes sense that, in my opinion, that Canada and the U.S. specifically would move to something that's perhaps a little bit more accurate and perhaps more damage focused.
Okay. Yeah. A little more nuanced, perhaps.
A little more nuance, yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's go through each scale because they're a little bit different. So Fujita scale tornadoes are broken out on a scale of F0 to F6. So this would be used to determine the damage broadly of any given tornado. It's just not aligned quite correctly because it's a little bit older. And so a tornado at the scale of F0 would have a wind speed of less than 72 miles per hour and would be expected to cause light damage. And light damage being, this has ripped up a bush, right? There's no more leaves on this tree, that kind of thing. Okay. Like very light.
Right.
This, of course, then ramps up, right? So an F1 would have wind speeds between 73 and 112 miles per hour, create more damage. F2, 113 to 157 miles per hour, cause significant damage at that point. An F3 would be 158 to 206 miles per hour and cause even more damage. And then we get to sort of the higher end scales, which would be F4, where now you have tornadoes that have wind speeds of between 207 and 260 miles per hour. And this is where the damage now turns into a more catastrophic level, right? This is no longer just a home here or there, which obviously is catastrophic for those individuals, but not necessarily for a whole community or city. F4 is where you start to hit those levels. And then you get into the F5, which has mile per hour speeds of between 261 and 318 miles per hour. And these are the ones where, well, again, if we go back to our Twister movie from the mid 1990s, that's the biggie, right? That's the one that ends up causing all the damage, and it's like the big bad of the episode. It's like the bad
category guy. 5 is maybe the way they refer to it, or something like that.
Right? Maybe, yeah. Yep. And so there's an F6 earthquake, or not earthquake, tornado. There's an F6 tornado that would have wind speeds greater than 318 miles per hour, and this would cause, well, really, it would cause inconceivable damage. And the reason why it will cause inconceivable damage is because there have been no recorded F6 tornadoes to have landed anywhere on the planet within the modern history, the recorded history.
So it could have happened, and it could still happen. But since we've been using this scale, there haven't been any.
There haven't been any, yep. But there have been a lot of F5 tornadoes. So the U.S. has had, the world has had 67 F5 tornadoes recorded in total, of which 59 of those have hit within the United States.
Well, that's most of them. Yeah. Wow.
That's most of them, yes. So now you can kind of understand why the US might be leaning towards a scale that's perhaps a little bit more nuanced towards what kind of damage you can expect. So that's where the enhanced Fujita scale comes in. And it's broken out between, well, still 6 scales, but this time it's between EFU and then through EF5. So EF0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the same basic sort of system, except the mile per hours are a little bit different. So in EFU, this is basically means they don't know how fast the wind speeds were going because it wasn't big enough to really be tracked. So it's no surveyable damage whatsoever. And then it goes up from there. So EF0, 65 to 85, EF1, 86 to 110, EF2, 111 to 135, EF3, 136 to 165, EF4, 166 to 200. And then the EF5, the biggest bad of them all, would be anything above 200 miles per hour. This would be a little different from the Fujita scale because our top end here is now tornadoes that happen, quite often, right? Not super common, but there's no longer a scale where it's like we don't have any sort of track record. So I don't have a count of how many EF5s there have been, but I can tell you based on the science that approximately one half of 0.1%, so a very small fraction of global tornadoes are EF5s. The most common would be the EF0 followed by the EF1. And those make up about 83 to 85% of all tornadoes.
Okay.
Wow, I've said a lot about tornadoes already, if you can believe it. We already have to hit our very first ad break here. And I really hope, listener, that it is an ad for Twisters for you right now, because I just like to think that our ads work in conjunction with our episode topics. I don't know. So anyways, go listen to these ads and maybe one will be for the movie and you'll go watch the movie. And we'll be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking all about tornadoes today. We've been talking about the movie Twister. We talk about the movie Twisters. We're going to keep talking a little bit about both those movies as we go through this. But I wanted to take a moment at the beginning of this part of our episode to talk about more specifically about where tornadoes strike. So, Hunter, where would you expect tornadoes to hit around the world?
Well, I'm based on what we learned in the first part of the episode. The United States is a pretty popular spot for tornadoes to hit, and I'm thinking sort of the Midwestern spine of the United States is where a lot of them are.
That is where the popular sort of idea of where tornadoes hit. That is, and that's true, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's a lot of tornadoes hit that region. And I would say that maybe it's a U.S. bias that we have here in this country. Maybe there is, just because it does happen very frequently within the United States, particularly within that area, there is a popular misconception that tornadoes generally only strike the U.S., aside from rare sort of freak sort of incidents outside of the United States. That said, tornadoes are actually not as unique as that, as maybe that misconception leads people to believe, or that idea. So every single continent, aside from Antarctica, has had a tornado hit somewhere within it to some degree of strength within the last year. So there's no place that has not had a tornado. And these are actual tornadoes, not dust devils, not, whatever. These are actual, full spouts, connecting sky to land. But that's not to say that all tornadoes are created equally. And I think that's sort of, again, that leads people to believe that a lot of tornadoes are, tornadoes only hit the United States. Because there are roughly 7 places where tornadoes happen most frequently. So the United States and Canada, tornadoes hit basically everywhere inside the United States and Canada, right? And we'll talk a little about this, but every state has had a tornado.
Wow.
Northern Mexico also gets a fair amount of tornadoes, mostly within the sort of same area that would be connecting into the, what we would call the Tornado Alley. Mm-hmm. We will talk more about Tornado Alley in a little bit. So let's move on from the United States and Canada. In Australia, particularly along the eastern coast, but sometimes on the west coast as well.
Okay.
In East Asia, primarily in the Philippines, Japan, and China. China is very interesting because they don't tend to get a lot of tornadoes, but when they do, they tend to be very destructive and they tend to hit urbanized areas far more often. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, a tornado that hit the Guangzhou metro area, 19 million people, and it basically flattened an entire industrial area of the city. And so it's when this happens in China, it typically tends to be far more destructive than, say, Tornado Alley. But that's in large part just due to the fact that there's a lot more people living in China, and it's hitting in an area that happens to be a lot more developed than Tornado Alley.
Right. So China's Tornado Alley has more people in it. That's what's happening, probably.
Yeah, but they don't really have a tornado alley. Okay. They get some tornadoes. It's not frequent enough in a single area. It's not as concentrated. And most places don't really have a tornado alley. There's a reason why Tornado Alley exists very specifically. There's a combination of geographic elements that occur that don't really occur in the same place to the same degree. And again, we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Great.
Continuing on, tornadoes will hit in eastern India and Bangladesh. They will hit in southern Africa within the country of South Africa, but also Lesotho and Eswatini. Broadly, Europe gets a lot of tornadoes, including Ireland and the United Kingdom. Typically, a lot of times they hit inside the water, so they're not quite as well known, though. And then in South America, around Buenos Aires area of Argentina, and then up into Uruguay, they will also get some tornadoes there. So while tornadoes are not uncommon in many parts of the world, the United States in particular stands out as being the country that gets the most tornadoes every year at a power that most other regions of the world rarely experience. And so this is sort of what I was talking about earlier. So like I already mentioned, every state in the US, including Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., has had a tornado touch ground at some point between 1950 and 2021. I think that was the most recent data I could find. Maybe there's some 2022 data out there now. And overall, during that span of 71 years, over 67,000 tornadoes have touched ground somewhere in the United States.
That's a whole lot
of tornadoes.
Yeah.
That's a lot of tornadoes.
Whoa.
And so that would translate to roughly 965 tornadoes hitting every single year. If we look at only the last 20 years, that number does increase to about 1,230 tornadoes every year. That might make you think that climate change has something to do with it. In fact, it's actually more likely just because we're able to record and track tornadoes with a higher degree of efficiency. So we're going to talk a little about that later. Europe, however, does, like I mentioned, does get quite a lot of tornadoes. So they get about 700 tornadoes per year. That's a bunch, yeah. But again, a lot of the power of the tornadoes in Europe are typically much smaller, so they're not as newsworthy, for lack of a better term. And many of Europe's tornadoes actually tend to be these warnings, which we've already covered and are far weaker, and they take place over water, so they're not really causing any damage. Aside from, if you have a fishing vessel inside of its path, then
that's bad.
That'll cause a mess.
Yep.
Yeah. And so this leads us to Tornado Alley. Hunter, where would you say Tornado Alley is? Like, can you map us a geographic boundary of this place?
All right. My guess is Tornado Alley is probably a loosely defined kind of area, so it could include different places, but I'm thinking that a lot of Texas, central Texas, into Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, reaching over into Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, maybe as far down as Louisiana and Mississippi. Maybe I'm drawing it too widely, but something like that. And then maybe reaching as far north into Canada as well.
It is funny because you hit on something that I think I almost immediately wanted to cover, and it's that this is a loosely defined, region, right?
It's a vernacular
depending on who you ask.
Yep.
Right. It's not, there's no one meteorologist or, the National Oceanic Administration, Atmosphere and Administration. Like, they haven't drawn like this is Tornado Alley and everything. I thought like that doesn't exist.
Right.
It is broadly just a swath of area within, more commonly associated with the states of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota.
Okay.
That would encompass this area. So you got all of those states. you did include, I think it was Missouri and Arkansas
Mhm.
and maybe even Louisiana. These are all states that get tornadoes too, right?
Yeah. Right.
Missouri, Missouri not is not technically, well, it's not commonly associated with Tornado Alley. I would argue that it is still very much a part of it because they still get a lot of tornadoes and they can
Mhm.
tend to be very destructive in Missouri, just as they can in Kansas, right?
Yeah, I remember reading a short piece by David Foster Wallace who talks about playing tennis in Tornado Alley, but he's located in, I think, Illinois at that point. So for
Mhm.
him, that's Tornado Alley. But again, that's what
That's
you
part of
get when you
Tornado
get
Alley.
a vernacular region. People can imagine it the way they want.
Exactly. So, regardless of sort of how you cut and slice Tornado Alley, if we just take those 6 states that I had mentioned as being sort of the most commonly referred to as, I would again be Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. If we just take those 6 states, those states have received 37% of all recorded tornadoes in the United States. So that's a big chunk
Yep.
um, of them, right? Of 67,000 tornadoes. That's a lot of tornadoes. And this is due to a very specific set of geographic circumstances that this region in particular gets hit with most. And so let's talk about this because again, this is very unique to the United States. So tornadoes, they form out of large thunderstorms. I don't think that's a big surprise here.
Okay.
So inside those storms, there's this warm, humid air that's rising while cool air starts to fall, right? This is sort of what creates that funnel system. And that sort of starts the spinning, right? These sort of mix of pressure systems that are going on. And it's this region that happens to get the ingredients to create that exact kind of storm system almost perfectly. So Tornado Alley exists at the confluence of three sort of geographic weather systems. So coming in from the north is a front of cold, dry air from Canada, the jet stream, and the Rocky Mountains that's sort of pushing its way south into this region.
Okay.
From the southwest, at the same time, you have this sort of gust of warm, dry air pushing in from the Mojave and Sonoran and sort of the Chihuahuan deserts of northern Mexico up into this region, right? It's moving up into sort of this Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas area. And then finally, the missing ingredient that a lot of places don't have at the same time is a heavy dose of warm, moist air that is moving in from the Gulf of Mexico up into this same exact region. And so when you get these three elements to combine, you sort of have the right concoction to create these really massive thunderstorms, which then are able to combine into to create this funnel system. And I think that is so interesting because Tornado Alley simply wouldn't exist if, let's say the Rocky Mountains weren't there, or the Mojave Desert wasn't there, or the Gulf of Mexico wasn't there. And the Gulf of Mexico is particularly interesting because it's a very large body of water that happens to be very warm and happens to be able to create these concoctions in a level that not very many other places in the world can. And so no other region in the world really has all three of these required ingredients as prominently as the United States. And that's why, if we go back to our Fujita scale, F5 tornadoes, I believe there were 67 total inside the world. And I think it was like 59 of them hit inside the United States.
Yeah, like
And that's the
most.
reason why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that adds up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting, right? It's like all these different things. How does this happen? Like, how do these things come together? It's like, well, there it is. It's like, it's all like it's almost like plain as English. If you just like know what these things are doing, you're like, oh yeah, I get it now. Like dry air, cold, very cold air, very hot, dry air, and very wet, moist, humid air. And it's like, you smash all this together, that's going to cause some issues for the
Perfect
atmosphere.
storm. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where things kind of get a little more interesting, Hunter, because while Tornado Alley does get a lot of tornadoes, and we've covered that already, as it turns out, it is actually one of the safer areas to be in with respects to regions that have a high amount of tornado activity. So,
Interesting.
Texas, for example, has approximately 1/3 the average annual amount of deaths caused by tornadoes
Mm.
than Alabama,
Okay.
despite Texas having many more tornadoes per year. Why do you think this might be?
I guess my guess is that there are more people living in sort of marginal circumstances closer to places where tornadoes are hitting. So, and then maybe the infrastructure is not as fired up. And so the damage that is done is more significant than it would be, for example, in Texas. That's my guess.
That's a great guess, and I am neither going to confirm nor deny it, because before we do that, we have to hit our last ad break.
Oh, I
So
got to
that's a
wait
little
to
bit of a
find out.
teaser.
We all got to wait. All right.
We all got to wait. So come back after the ad break, listen to these ads. Hopefully it's another Twisters ad, and come back and we'll talk a little bit about whether Hunter was right or wrong. So I guess we'll be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We just ran through a bunch of tornado information. We just ran through all about Tornado Alley, and I left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger where I asked Hunter why Alabama might be more dangerous with respects to tornadoes than Texas. And you had mentioned what did you mention again about that?
So my response dealt with that there were probably more people, perhaps more people in the line of tornadoes to begin with, but also living in conditions that are less secure, perhaps. Maybe has something to do with the proximity to bodies of water or something like that. But yeah, I'm thinking it's mostly like sociological kind of stuff going on here.
Well, you are partially right. There's actually multiple reasons, as there always is.
Usually is.
So. Yeah. And luckily, there's a geographic answer for us because we're a geography podcast. Those are always fun. So let's go back a little bit before I fully answer the question. Let's talk a little bit about Alabama and Mississippi more broadly, so that we can sort of get an idea of how are they getting tornadoes, because they are a little departed from Tornado Alley, but they are getting tornadoes.
Right.
So overall, these two states, they account for about 7% of all tornadoes in the country. Not a huge amount necessarily, but I would argue still a significant amount.
Yes.
And they experience these storms for largely the same reason as Tornado Alley, right? The cold air from Canada, the warm air from the Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert, and then the moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. Same ingredients sort of being pulled together, but they occur less frequently because the cold northern air from Canada doesn't often reach as far south as it does Kansas, Nebraska, or even Texas.
It's missing, often missing one of those ingredients.
It's often missing one of those key ingredients, and it typically tends to be that cold air. But when a tornado does hit these two states, things can get a little dicey. So you see, there are three primary reasons why Alabama, specifically Alabama, but this would also include Mississippi. Alabama specifically has a much higher fatality rate when it comes to tornadoes than, say, Texas. And the first is that, as it turns out, most tornadoes that hit the Southeast tend to be nocturnal tornadoes.
Okay.
So this is because tornadoes tend to strike in the Southeast in the early spring when there are fewer hours in the day. And so a tornado that hits at night, well, people tend to be sleeping, right? They tend to be less active, less aware, or even, they're just not seeing any as much, right? They're not noticing that there's even a storm, perhaps. Right?
They're inside, perhaps. Yeah.
They're inside. And so this creates issues when you need to get people into shelter quickly. And so there's that aspect. The second reason, though, is simply, this is sort of what you were alluding to, is simply that the Southeast is far more built up and developed than the Great Plains states, right? So if you look at a map, listener, go Google and if you're watching on YouTube, it'll be here in front of you, but go Google like a nighttime aerial map of the United States. And you can see all of the lights that are, go throughout that pop up throughout the country where there's some sort of population center. And you can see that line that sort of hits where all of a sudden there's no more development. It's almost like a very broad stroke, and it's sort of this area, this big swath from north to south where it's like, where did all the people go? Of course, there are people living there, but it's just far fewer.
Right.
Alabama and Mississippi are firmly within the region where there's a lot of development. And so you can start to see, okay, a tornado pops down in Alabama, far higher chance that it's going to hit where people are actually living versus the Great Plains, where there's actually a pretty sizable chance that it's going to hit nowhere. just like in the middle of a field somewhere, middle of grassy plains.
Mm-hmm. And not doing as much damage, and not as big a cost to human well-being, human life.
Absolutely. And finally, and this is kind of similar to the last reason, but the natural geography of the Southeast does create more hazards for when a tornado does inevitably hit. So Alabama and Mississippi, they tend to have more trees, which will, when a tornado hits them, will be picked up and typically thrown around, and that causes a lot of damage. I'm sure most people have seen sort of one of those iconic images of sort of like a tree branch that's like now in the middle of like a fence because it sort of like was thrown at such a high speed that sort of busted right through, and sort of very, I don't know, uncanny a little bit. It's like, how did that even happen?
Yeah.
And there's like still leaves on it somehow. And you're like, wow, that's weird.
And wood is heavy. So yeah, it can do some damage.
Wood is heavy, tends to be a lot of damage when it hits things. Yes. The other thing though, is that the area of Alabama tends to have a lot of rolling hills.
Okay.
And these are able to hide oncoming tornadoes in ways that they can't and they don't really in the Great Plains, which don't have the same kind of rolling topography. And so for these three reasons, this region, these two states tend to have a much deadlier history than places that get more frequent and oftentimes even more powerful tornadoes. And it's just the natural geography of and the human geography of where we built, right? And these are things that have all occurred, that we've all done, and sort of it creates this system where the tornado is going to just cause a lot more damage. And so all of this creates an area where, that has fewer tornadoes with a far deadlier record than Tornado Alley. And so now let's go back to sort of what I was talking about early on the beginning of the episode. Let's leave behind Tornado Alley a little bit. Let's talk more broadly about tornadoes and climate change. So if you recall, at the beginning of the episode, we were talking about this Twisters movie,
right.
And that movie very intently focuses on an ever-increasing amount of power of tornadoes and damage of these mega storms that are causing. I haven't seen it, but I'm assuming it's very like intense and suspenseful and all this stuff. But apparently, so the movie neglects to mention climate change even once. It's just completely left out of the equation. And this was done because the director apparently didn't want to be political. Didn't want this to be a political statement, XYZ. I think we can both agree that that is probably political unto itself.
It's in and of itself a political statement. I agree.
Because, I mean, it's climate change. It's a thing. It's happening. It's whatever. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the director may have actually made the right call, though I would argue for the wrong reason.
Okay, so break it down.
So let's break it down. So climate change. So okay, let's go back a little bit. So according to a National Geographic article on the subject, climate change's impact on the frequency, power, and duration of tornadoes is complex and not well understood yet, even to this day. This is an article from 2023. It didn't have an author, which I thought was weird. I think it was just sort of one of their boilerplate explainer things. Just wanted to call that out. I'm not leaving out an author. It just didn't include one. But according to this article, predicting how climate change affects tornadoes is difficult due to their relatively small size, short lifespans compared to other extreme weather events such as hurricanes. So instead, scientists have been focusing on how climate change alters the conditions necessary for supercell thunderstorms. Those are the things that cause this stuff, right? And those, it produces the tornadoes. And so these conditions, again, they include warm, moist air, an unstable atmosphere, and wind shear. Climate change increases atmospheric instability, but apparently it's also been seen to decrease wind shear. So this makes it hard to predict the net effect on tornado formation. So they're sort of, in a way, canceling each other out, right? Climate change is increasing the instability of the atmosphere up there, but the wind shear is actually going down. So you need both of these in high quantities to create the tornado. And so this is sort of where scientists are stumbling over themselves a little bit. It's like, well, climate change is happening. It's a thing, but are they having an impact on tornadoes? It's not really, they can't really figure that out yet. Now, studies do suggest that climate change might lead to more severe thunderstorms. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean tornadoes, as only a fraction of supercells actually produce tornadoes. So again, we might see, one aspect of the tornado system come into play, but it might not ever create the necessary conditions for an actual tornado to hit the ground. And again, if we go back to sort of when we had that full count of tornadoes, I mentioned, there's 1,265 tornadoes on average per year since 1990. A lot of people point to that as a reason for, clearly there's an increase in tornadoes. But again, just to call it out, the technology that has gone into tracking tornadoes has improved dramatically since 1990. And so we're able to track them much more frequently. So there could have been, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, there could have been more tornadoes that we just weren't tracking. Obviously there were. We didn't have the same technology to track them. And there were fewer people to even look at them, right? There's a lot more people now than there were in 1960 or 1970.
Right. So there's a lot more incidences of recording them. And I mean, this is also an illustration of something we've talked about a few times before on the program, which is that climate change is real and it's having some very significant effects. However, not everything that has to do with the weather is necessarily related to climate change, right? Like that.
Right.
If something extreme happens, it may or may not be related to climate change. It sounds like there's a lot of research going on. So we should acknowledge climate change, but we do ourselves a disservice if we just assume that everything that's cataclysmic that's happening is necessarily related to it.
Exactly. Right. So all this is to say, Hunter, is that recent research is inconclusive on sort of the direct impacts of climate change on tornadoes, but it is showing that tornado patterns are changing. So there are now apparently fewer days that have at least one tornado, but more days that have multiple tornadoes. So leading to clustered tornado events. There are some geographic shifts indicate that fewer tornadoes are hitting Tornado Alley, but more in the southeastern United States, such as Alabama and Mississippi. But these changes might be linked to climate change, or they might not be, right? So it's difficult to distinguish, individual events, as you were mentioning just now, from climate variations and climate change from events that have been happening for a lot longer, such as events like El Nino or La Nina, right? And, maybe then you can trace that there's more El Nino or more La Ninas related to climate change, but it's starting to get a little too far departed from these very, small, relatively small, isolated events to like be able to draw these big fat lines to. So,
right.
One last thing, according to the National Climate Assessment, while some extreme weather can be directly attributed to global warming, the link between climate change and tornadoes remains uncertain. So this is from our national climate sort of governing body. Climate change does result in warmer, wetter world that will affect extreme weather events, but they don't know whether that's actually causing an impact on tornadoes. And so that's all I really have to say about tornadoes today. It's been a lot of windy, gusty talk. I don't know.
Breezy conversation. Yeah. No, I'm realizing now that I didn't know a lot of this stuff. So it's good that I was here to listen to you because I just learned a lot.
Well, Hunter, tornadoes can hit Oregon, but it's pretty rare. So we probably won't have to deal with one. And if one does ever hit, and actually I think one hit a couple years ago, and I remember seeing a video on it. I think it was somewhere down like in Salem area, which is, listener, if you're not aware of Oregon geography or cities, it's about 45 minutes south of Portland. Anyways, it was pretty small. I think it picked up I saw it like pick up and move a car like a few feet.
Whoa,
right? It's like sort of lifted one end and like dropped it.
Wow.
Not like fully off. It just sort of picked up one side. Still though, that's not nothing, right? It's still like
it messed up your transmission for sure. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. But overall, relatively mild. So while this has been an easy breezy discussion of tornadoes, we don't have to necessarily be worried too much about it. And those of you who are in Tornado Alley or within the Southeast, hopefully you are better prepared than, certainly we are up here with your various alert systems. So, anyways, Hunter, where can people find you if they want to do that? Or just tell people who you are.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland as a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And with you, Jeff, I'm co-host of the Geography is Everything podcast, which you're listening to right now.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Gibson. I'm also the co-host of this podcast. Really fun talking all about tornadoes today. It's really fun talking about everything, all the geography we get to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to find me elsewhere around the web, you can. I'm over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. And you can listen to, or you can watch all the videos I've created. You can also listen to my other podcast now, Around the World with Jeff, where I just talk about different countries and states and provinces. And I have a guest who is from that place. And so they sort of help walk us through it. And you sort of get the perspective of somebody who's there.
The local knowledge, yeah.
A local knowledge, or at least somebody who has significant experience with it. I shouldn't say not everybody's always going to be in the place that they're talking about, and that's fine.
Sure.
Go check that out, Around the World. You can listen on every podcast app you want, or on YouTube on my same YouTube channel. If you like this conversation on tornadoes and you learned something, you really enjoyed it, you you really enjoyed learning all about sort of Tornado Alley and the unique geographic aspects of that place on the planet, then please like and subscribe over on YouTube if you're watching there, or rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, Pocket Casts, any of these wonderful apps that are out there. Really helps us out. It's really fun seeing those, and I read each one, and people are usually highly complimentary. If you want this delivered directly into your email, you can. That's just over on geographyIsEverything.substack.com. So go and sign up over there. Totally free. Check it out. Next week, Hunter, I'm starting to get a little parched here. I don't know if you can tell. It's like talking. Next week, we're going to tackle one of the largest corporations in the world. True. Hunter, this is actually going to be your episode. You're going to be leading this one.
That's right.
But it's all about Nestle.
It's all about Nestle, and it is the largest food company in the world, I believe, and has been around for a while and has made some pretty big impacts in different parts of the world. So truly transnational. And so there's a lot of geographies of Nestle to talk about.
Yeah. And just based on what I know, I've not done any of the research for this episode, but just based on what I know, it has a very dark and destructive history, particularly with some very specific regions of the world that I know.
Yeah, there's some controversial aspects to what they've been selling and where they've been selling it. So we'll talk about that stuff for sure.
Well, come back next week. We'll talk all about Nestle. And I guess until then, I don't know. I hope I stay away from tornadoes. Don't go north. If you see a tornado, go the other way. That's the message for today. That's your ending message.
That's your PSA.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.